Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you've decided to join us today for another episode of the ResearchWorks podcast.
Yes, thank you for joining us again. Today on the pod, we have the wonderful Sarah McIntyre from the Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Institute and the University of Sydney. Welcome, Sarah.
Welcome.
Oh, thanks, guys. It's really exciting to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's exciting for us to get to talk to you. And we've been really looking forward to speaking with you about, this paper in particular. For our listeners, the paper that we're discussing with Sarah today is titled Global Prevalence of Cerebral Palsy, a systematic review which was published in 2022 in Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology. So this paper, obviously, Sarah, represents a really large international study group that you're speaking on behalf of today. But before we get into the details of the paper, we will tell you all a little bit about Sarah.
Cool.
Because we know lots about her.
We do, I know. We're fans.
Yeah, absolutely.
Big fans.
So Sarah is a Senior Research Fellow and is the leader of the Epidemiology Theme of the Research Institute, Cerebral Palsy Alliance. She manages the New South Wales Australian Capital Territory Cerebral Palsy Register and is the current chair of the Australian Cerebral Palsy Register. She is the perinatal and paediatric epidemiologist who has worked in the cerebral palsy field for over 15 years. Her current work focuses on analysing and reporting trends based off the CP registers, investigating aetiology and prevention opportunities for cerebral palsy and neonatal encephalopathy, with a particular emphasis on congenital anomalies.
Well said. You did real good. Well done. And a very, very impressive bio, Sarah. And you're just like one of the nicest people you ever meet. Let's put that in there too.
100%. Put that on the record.
Too kind. You two both.
So, Sarah, I know you've listened to a few episodes before, so you are bracing yourself for an icebreaker question.
I am.
So our question today is, what fictional world or place would you like to visit? And I'm asking this question because I feel like we've talked about real travel a lot, about places that we'd like to go or places that we've been, but I thought we'd just take it to the next level and talk completely fictional today.
Oh, this is hard for someone who's facts-based.
I know. I'm asking you to step outside your comfort zone.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me think. Well, I tell you what, I love trees. Like, I'm a tree lover.
Yep.
So I would love to be transported to be a little something animal-wise that's in a forest and find out about the forest world. And trees and all the little things that I know talk to each other.
Yes, I love that.
But I would love to be a part of that for a minute and hear all that
100%.
chitter-chatter in the bush.
Yeah.
Like Fern Gully.
Oh, yeah.
Like Fern Gully.
Fern Gully.
Do kids know what Fern Gully is these days?
They should.
Is that just our time? I can't remember, but Fern Gully's great.
Fern Gully was one of my favourite movies growing up.
Yeah, that's a good one.
You've reminded
Sarah.
me that I need to educate my children about Fern Gully. That is, a non-negotiable. And your answer, Sarah, I think ties in really closely to what I was thinking because my favourite books growing up were Enid Blyton's Faraway Tree books.
Oh, yes.
So I think if I was going to go anywhere, it would be to the magic Faraway Tree.
That's a really
very
good one.
close.
I really like that. Oh, okay. Well, I like both of those actually, because I'm fans of both. The one that first came to mind, though, I don't know if it's because I just watched the movie or something, but Wakanda. I think I'd like to go to Wakanda. Because it just looks so rich and all sorts of it's got some real traditional elements to it, but really scientific as well. And it's its own little place and it's got its own little dome of protection and, it seems really cool. So I kind of like the whole thing of, superhero kind of stuff as well. So it'd be Wakanda for me.
I love that.
And we could do a podcast out of Wakanda quite eeasily because they're so techie. And so you could broadcast all across the world. And
Producer Ed's getting nervous. He might be out of a job, but it's fiction. It's fiction.
Yeah, it's fiction. That's true. That's true. But
Purely
I wouldn't mind
fictional.
it. I wouldn't mind it. Yeah.
I love that. Well, Dana, why don't you take us out of the fictional world and back into our facts and science and talk to us about the abstract for this paper.
All right, scene. All right, so this systematic review aimed to identify the trends in birth prevalence for cerebral palsy, or CP, of pre or perinatal origin, post-neonatal CP, and overall CP by region, and was combined for two major networks, that being the Surveillance of Cerebral Palsy in Europe and the Australian Cerebral Palsy Register, since birth year 1995. This review also aimed to identify the most recent birth prevalence estimate and period prevalence estimate of CP by region and combined for those of data available from birth year 2010 for a current prevalence estimate. So the results include representation from 41 regions from 27 countries across 5 continents. It was found that pre- and perinatal birth prevalence has declined significantly across Europe and Australia, with no changes in post-neonatal CP. However, from the data that was available from regions of low and middle income countries, the birth prevalence of pre- and perinatal CP remains high.
Thank you, Dana.
No problem.
All right, Sarah, let's zoom out and start right at the beginning so that everyone who's listening is on the same page as us as we kind of travel through this conversation. So can you talk to us about the current definition of cerebral palsy? Because I feel like that's kind of an important context to have when we talk about the rest of this paper.
It is a good place to start. Yes. So CP is caused by damage to the brain or because of the brain developing differently. And that happens early in development. And so what we mean by early is from the very beginning of brain development in pregnancy through to around 2 years of age. And the current definition states that CP covers a group of permanent, so it's not progressive, permanent disorders of movement and posture, and these cause activity limitations. And when the latest definition was developed, it was developed by a group of researchers and they all came together and had a big discussion. Importantly, they thought it was really important to add to that not only people always have a motor condition, but many have accompanying disorders as well. So around 30% of people with CP will also have epilepsy. 45% will have an intellectual impairment, and about a third will have problems with vision. So it's complex and really does look very different for everyone, CP, but it's complex because of all those different variables that could be associated with it.
Yeah. And I suppose the different potential combination of those variables that you're likely to see at any given point in time as well.
That's correct.
Yeah. So, Sarah, what do we know about the risk factors for CP?
Yes. Well, because you can imagine, because the brain injury can occur any time from very early all the way through to 2, there's multiple risk factors. And so they may be things like genomic variations very early in the piece, infections during pregnancy, congenital anomalies, multiple pregnancies are a risk factor, and that's mainly because of their risk of being born premature. But the main 2 big risk factors are very early premature birth and also babies who are born at term, and you've already got your head around these words, who have neonatal encephalopathy.
Yes.
And what that really means is that when a baby's born at term and they're born and immediately they are sick and need to go to an intensive care unit, predominantly because of neurological signs. So they're the big risk factors. But most of the time they work in combination with each other, and very rarely is there one thing that causes CP. It's more a combination of the risk factors.
And just while we're on definitions and kind of setting the scene, can you also explain to our listeners what we mean when we refer to pre-perinatal and postnatal periods?
Yes, that's a good question. So pre-perinatal cerebral palsy means that this is all about timing of the birth injury or different development. And so pre-perinatal CP is if the child's injury has happened either during pregnancy, around the time of birth, or in the first month after birth. And post-neonatal injury is after 1 month of life and through to the age of 2. And they can be very different groups, so we do tend to split them.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked to other researchers previously about the different types of injuries that you're likely to see depending on kind of where they occur within that period of development. So already there's lots of variability, I suppose, in, the type of injury that you're seeing and therefore, flowing on from that, the symptoms that you're likely, the presentation and symptoms that you're likely to see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we've spoken to, as well as talking about those injuries and the developmental periods, we've also talked to researchers who've used cerebral palsy registers to draw out information previously that really influences, I suppose, how we operate in our clinical practice. So can you give us a bit of a rundown? I know you are the register or registry guru, a bit of a rundown on how long these population-based CP registers have been around and what they offer us, I suppose.
Yeah, there's really a rich history, actually. So the first registers commenced in the 70s and Western Sweden, Denmark, and then you guys will be glad to know Western Australia were the pioneers. Very much
flying the flag.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we've looked to you guys for a long time. And data from these registers goes back to the 1950s.
Yeah.
In Australia, South Australia and Victoria were up and running in the 80s and 90s. And in the early 2000s, we all agreed that in Australia we should aim for a register in every state. And that in the 2000s, mid to late 2000s, we formed the Australian CP Register. And states upload data every 2 years to that register. And our latest report was actually launched in January. So we have new stats from that report. The registers have many functions, but at the core, we really aim to provide as up-to-date data as possible about trends and prevalence. Are the rates going up or down? If they are, in what groups? So that we can drive new ideas for priority areas and report back to those working on the ground that, what you're doing is actually working. And it's about evaluation in the real world for measurement and interventions that are put in place, both public health and medical interventions. So out of that research context, how we talk about a research effect, we might do a research study and we see a reduction in whatever the outcome might be. But what happens when it's in the real world? So this is actually real world data. And I think that's its biggest contribution. But we're also able to support and advocate for health and disability funding for those living with CP currently by providing these estimates and these numbers. And we help researchers recruit to their studies as well through the registers. And we can provide information for anyone who wants it. And that can be families contacting us directly. It can be students and researchers. People writing grants use the data all the time. So it's being used by a cross-section of things at the moment, which is great.
Yeah, and it's really such a impressive vehicle for knowledge translation, I think, isn't it? You're really kind of seeing that high-level implementation of evidence into practice and what that means for these children and their families.
Yes.
And I guess on that, when you just said, who accesses this information, myself as a researcher, when you're wanting to write a grant because you have an idea for a research project to meet a need, well, you first have to go back to am I actually meeting a need and how many people are going to be impacted? And you have a really good idea about where it currently sits. And what I love about the register, particularly in Australia, is that because there are such great publications that happen so frequently, they're just really up-to-date, tangible information. Sometimes things might be a bit old, but so many things have been changing. So it's such a rich source of information.
Well, we did change our reporting to help with this. And so we were originally doing it every 3 years, and now we do ACPR reports every 2 years. The second one is more of a bulletin, like a shorter update, just to keep on top of the trends. And then the big one, which is the one we've just launched this year, it ends up being every 4 years with a bulletin in between. So we try and keep it as up-to-date as possible. Absolutely.
That just reflects how exciting the area is, that there's so many changes that are always happening, which is why you've had to do all these extra publications. And that really reflects so much on there. So you've spoken a bit about the registers, which registers sort of exist around the world. Talk to me a little bit about the low to middle income countries, because I think that's a really interesting area where there are some registers that are starting to evolve.
Yes, this is an exciting area, and really I have to give all praise to Prof. Gulam Kandaka, who really has started this movement. We work really closely with Gulam, and he developed the first LMIC register, which was in Bangladesh, in rural Bangladesh, and the success of that register really did inspire other groups all around the world to approach him and to approach registers already up and running for support and mentorship to get registers going in their areas. So we do have registers in, so Bangladesh is, of course, the most important one that's up and running, but Moldova, Ghana, Jordan, there's 2 developing in China, which is exciting.
Wow.
Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Nepal, Indonesia, and Suriname.
Wow.
And they're not whole country registers, they're region specific, but it's a fantastic explosion of knowledge from these areas, and they're actually all really different. So that's why it's important to have the regional registers, because you can't just clump LMIC, because they're very different.
That's right.
Yeah. And so when you say they're different, are they different? Are they collecting similar information? It's just that what you're seeing is different across those different regions?
Correct. Yeah. So we have a minimum data set in Australia that we model really closely with surveillance of cerebral palsy in Europe, and everyone tries to collect a minimum data set that's the same, and then context specific, everyone collects what's additionally important to their context. So we know that there's different trends, there's different, well, actually we can't report trends in low and middle income countries yet because it's too early, but we do know that there's different risk factors in different countries. We know there's different prevalence. So, very different. And in our first global LMIC paper, we had 4 different regions, and we were originally going to combine those, but they were actually so different with gestational age, just across everything, that we had to report them individually.
Right. Yep.
So, yes, very
You've given us
context
a bit of
specific.
a sample there of what sort of gets collected. Can you give us a bit of a summary of what are the minimal data sets, I suppose, that you just referred to?
Yeah.
That'll be really interesting. Yeah.
So we collect minimum data on demographics, so where a child was born, a little bit about parents, the age of the parents when the child was born, where they were living at the time. Then we collect a bit about the pregnancy and the birth, so the gestational age of the child, birth weight of the baby, whether they had an IVF pregnancy, for instance, any major problems during pregnancy. Try and keep it as minimal as possible because we're trying to do populations. So we have to keep containing ourselves.
It's so hard.
You know what researchers are like. We want to collect more. So we contain. And then when a child is diagnosed, we collect information about the type of CP at that point. And then the big data about the child and their type of CP and associated impairments is collected at around the age of 5, so that we're sure the child has CP, and it's a little bit older, so that we're able to look at things like intellectual impairment and other things that may occur over that first few years as well.
It's no small thing, is it?
No.
Like it's, when you think about what's involved with it, but how valuable it is, and to have that much buy-in from so many regions and countries around the world is really incredible. And that, like you said, it's a movement, right? When you have everyone sort of coming together and have this common cause, it is a movement. And it's a good cause.
Yeah.
And it's a real team effort. It's not just the people working on the register.
Of course.
We need to work with teams in the hospitals, so to allow us to get the medical records, and so through community organisations as well.
Yeah.
So there's, as you said, a big buy-in from many people to make this happen.
So great. Yeah. So great. Yeah.
And I suppose that, they all do that because they see the value in it. So it's, it's, like you say, a huge example of teamwork and working towards a common goal, I think.
On a global scale. It's really cool. Yeah. Really, really cool.
Very fun.
So should we get into the real sort of, I guess, the nitty-gritty of this paper?
Yes.
Sure. Which is, we spoke a little bit earlier about, the importance of this. But I guess in a nutshell, Sarah, like, why did your team and the group of researchers feel it was important to publish this paper? What was the big purpose behind it?
Yeah, well, the big purpose really was to update knowledge about what the prevalence of CP is currently. And the last time a global paper like this was done was by Miriam Ascui, who's a good friend and collaborator, and on this paper as well. And the data that was in her paper was from the 80s and early 90s. And that showed that prevalence was 2.1 per 1,000 live births. And it had been stable throughout the time of that systematic review. So we were starting to get early evidence that things weren't the same as that. And we wanted to really get the evidence and identify if things had changed and if so, what it was. And the other thing was that we knew we had this emergence of low and middle income countries as well. And we wanted to really get out there some early statistics about these countries so that you need that first runs on the board so that awareness is raised about this. And so they were the two main aims, to see if trends were reducing instead of staying stable and to identify the new prevalence rates as well.
And you had kind of two main sources of information, didn't you? The registers, which we've talked about in detail, but what other information were you using for this study?
Yes. So the design of this was called a systematic analysis, and that was because we wanted to bring new data from the registers. So all the registers sent us new tabulated data so that it was as up to date as possible. And then we wanted to be as inclusive as possible. So we know that not every region in the world can have a register, and there are other methodologies to identify prevalence So we included anything from the literature if it was population prevalence from anywhere in the world. And that meant that we could look at so many more regions than what we could have looked at if we just used registers. So,
wow. Gosh,
such a big job.
On the big job, I need to put a shout out to, this was a big collaborative effort.
Yeah,
but
please do.
Shona Goldsmith, who's the second author on this paper, her and I did the bulk of that nitty gritty, that bit.
Yes, we all know that bit.
So I really wanted to shout out to Shona because without her, with me, we wouldn't have got this paper over the line. So
no, that's so important.
Thanks, Shona.
Yeah. Gosh, and that bit, I know, like we're all laughing about it, but we always have these parts of, when you're publishing a paper, there's always this part where it's that bit.
Yes.
And you sit there and you go, oh, this is just so painful.
And also intellectually difficult as well, to work out the methods. And so that was really, amazing work from her.
Yeah. And so you always feel really fortunate and grateful when you have someone that you can, get in the weeds with, so to speak, and, laugh and cry and
sure,
celebrate. Like each other even more at the end of
it. What a process.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you guys persisted because it is great that we're on this end of it, which is amazing. So a bit of a rundown then on what was actually included in the review.
Yes.
Or in the analysis, sorry. Yeah.
In the analysis, So what was included was data from 40 countries, 40 regions, I should say, from 27 countries. And we were able to report on trends for high-income countries and regions. And so the trends really showed that for 80% of the regions, there was a decline over this current time period from 1995 through to now. And then we were able to, for the first time, combine the Australian Register with Surveillance of Cerebral Palsy Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the two largest networks currently. And we saw no differences. There was no statistical difference between the two sets of rates.
Wow,
so we were able
okay.
to combine those and
Yeah.
show that we can now with confidence say
Yeah.
that there is a decline in CP in Australia and Europe at least.
Wow.
So that was the first big finding.
Yeah.
And then the second finding was about current prevalence. And
Yep.
so that really, in the end, we were only able to include high-income countries in the current prevalence as well in the meta-analysis.
Yeah.
And so that showed a new finding of 1.6 per 1,000 live births. And that's 25% less than the 2.1, which is what we all had previously written in our first lines of our
yes
of our thesis
and grant applications.
That's right.
Yep.
So, this is a new finding for people to start referring to, and it's current from 2010 onwards.
Yeah.
So low-income countries, we didn't include in that, but we have reported that the prevalence for them is over 3.3, so 3 to 4 per 1,000.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that's concerning because it's at least double.
Yeah.
And, of course, the great majority of the people in the world live in low and middle-income countries. So that means there is more people at a greater rate in low and middle income countries. So,
gosh, that's incredible. So much to digest there. I feel like I've got like 1,000 questions. I'm trying to think of the best question to ask you next.
Yeah.
Because there's so much.
I suppose just on that, Sarah, was there, we've talked about the kind of key findings, but was there anything else that stood out to you from these different registers or published data regarding the prevalence of CP? Were there things that were unexpected to you or a little bit surprising, or were you, what jumped out at you?
Yeah, well, what jumped out was really, well, I'm not sure if it jumped out because I had suspicions.
Yes.
But it was this big difference between low and middle income and high income countries is the main take home jump out.
Yeah.
And that we need to be thinking about resources and what to do in low and middle income countries because, as I said before, every context is completely different. And so it's very difficult for high income countries to recommend what to do for low and middle income countries because just so different in every place you look.
Yeah.
So it jumped out to me as an enormity and that we really need to focus energies in this space and help collaborators around the world who want to work in this space.
Yeah. And find strategies that work within their context, right?
Yes. Yeah. So one of the big strategies that works in high-income countries is therapeutic hypothermia, and that's cooling.
Yeah.
Most people know it's cooling. Those babies who have neonatal encephalopathy, if the reason for their encephalopathy is hypoxia or ischemia, they have cooling now for up to 72 hours in an intensive care unit in high-income countries. So that was one of the obvious places to start for low and middle-income countries because this is a big cause of CP for them. But unfortunately, in one of the very big RCT that came out last year from India showed that it didn't have the same effect.
Oh, interesting.
So that was really, in fact, they said we need to stop and really think about implementation of strategies from high income to low income. And they were almost suggesting we need to go back to the drawing board. So it's not as simple as, and people don't necessarily know why, and others are looking into this that know a lot more than me. But it was just a real, very important wake-up call of not thinking, oh, we'll just tell them, what we do.
And it's as simple as that. Yeah,
exactly. So it's their other main message was please make sure we do RCTs before we implement
that's so important
high income country findings. So we need to advocate for more funding for this sort of research as well, so that there's some equity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing from that as well is that in low to middle income countries, like you just said, we need to conduct RCTs, but within that context, like it needs to almost be context driven strategies.
Absolutely.
And, I find that to be, there's a lot to think about there, isn't there? Because I feel like we've learnt so much, and sometimes when we live within our own context, it's really hard to appreciate all the challenges and the barriers that might exist in a different context. And unless you're there with local people, local doctors, and hospitals and funding systems, translation is, it's not as seamless as we might think it is. Things we know work. It's confronting to think about that.
Yeah.
And in Australia, we have a public health system that, although we cry out for more, it is a fantastic system. And you need to have a whole system around an intervention, not just the intervention on its own.
Yeah, that's right.
So in Australia, for example, and many high-income countries, we have wonderful teams. In New South Wales, it's called NETs, so transfer teams. So if a baby is born a long way away from a major hospital, they can ring the NETS team, and the NETS team are already working with that baby's clinicians to put cooling strategies in place. They're already being cooled. You have to cool in the first 6 hours. So they're already being cooled, whether it's just taking off the blankets or whether it's something to keep the baby low temperature until the NETS team get there. They transfer. So they're in a much better place because they have that system. So that's part of the whole of cooling system is that, coming from anywhere and everywhere, we have that whole system around us in Australia, and it's not necessarily the same throughout the world.
No. And I guess that's taken, really decades to get to that place. When you talk about the first registers that were reported on, many years ago now, what you said, 80s and 90s sort of time frame, that would have already been positioning ourselves to think of what to do and tracking the prevalence. So over that time is it's probably reflective of that decrease in that prevalence rate.
Yeah.
Yet you start in another country, you almost need to go, okay, we've got the register now, and that hopefully doesn't take as long. But I guess
that's the thing. How can we use the lessons that we've learned, but within context specific? And the other thing that's happening around the world in low and middle income countries is that there weren't many intensive care units, so premature babies weren't surviving in low and middle income countries. And as we saw in Australia, as intensive care units became viable and part of our public health system, that CP rates did go up as babies survived at a lower and lower age. So
so the survival rates go
survival
up.
rates then go up, and then neonatologists and the whole teams are able to understand more how to help these babies. The more they're used to working with a 28-week baby, then a 24-week baby, it's just a whole new world each time that survival goes up. So low and middle income countries are possibly going to have a rise in CP, as we saw, as survival increases as well.
Yeah, so almost kind of following that same pattern that we saw in those high-income countries. It's just kind of the shift in terms of time is backwards a little bit.
That's correct.
Yeah. That's
and
really interesting.
That relates to severity as well, doesn't it? In terms of GMSs 4 and 5, I imagine that's something that we'll probably see maybe more severe cases in these instances. Gosh.
Yeah, well, the low and middle income countries do have a greater proportion of children who are GMFCS 4 and 5. We see that already.
Right.
That's one of the differences.
Right. Yep. Are there any other differences that you note from? I mean, obviously we looked at the actual prevalence as the sort of easy to report and digest number, and now we've spoken about the severity. Was there any other sort of differences within the registers?
within the high-income countries, we can say that there is variation, but in high-income countries, even across our own states in Australia, there's variations in trends and rates, but they stay within the same general band.
Yeah, okay.
But so it does show that variation does exist. It's not this static thing. And that's why we need more and more numbers. And it's probably why with the post-neonatal rates as well that we can't really see the trends as well, because it is a lot smaller numbers. So in high-income countries, in Australia, for example, post-neonatal children with postnatal CP, I should say, is about 6% of CP.
Okay.
Whereas in some low-income countries, it can be as high as 45% of CP is postnatal. So that's another one of the big differences. And that could be that there's infections and such as malaria and things that we don't see that children in low and middle income countries will get CP as a result of those sorts of infections. So that's another variation.
Yeah, so interesting.
It isn't. Yeah. I was thinking, Sarah, like it's I've been doing some work in Malaysia for quite some time now, and during COVID didn't really get to go back very much, but probably for the last 13 years I've been going, just working with some of the community organizations. They've recently established our own like community organization, but having like local staff involved and working with the hospital. And one of the things that struck me the most about it was the number of children that had dyskinetic cerebral palsy, and their GMS is 4s and 5s. And it was so confronting for me to see that, because they didn't also have any equipment. So it's not only just the fact that they've got this diagnosis, but the follow through all the way is so challenging to watch, and on a family level, and having no equipment, and parents who are aging, carrying their children. But what struck me was the dyskinesia and the dystonia. I'd never seen anything like that before. We do see some of that in Australia, obviously, but I just felt like I was seeing
not on that scale,
not
a
like
different type of CP.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
right.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what the different causes will do. So it's a big thing to address. And I think what Ghulam did with the register in rural Bangladesh was not something that we do in high-income countries. In fact, he based services came off the register. So the first thing he did in this area was there was nothing. There was no services at all, as you're talking about. And so by developing the register, he started to provide local people, teaching them to provide services. So they've even gone. They're even doing things like building their own wheelchairs locally, and people with CP are helping to do that in a factory over there. They're looking at poverty, because in low and middle income countries, when children, or what we've found is that families with children with CP are even in the most poor of the poor in low and middle income countries. So looking at how to provide microfinance for mums to get some work to bring in some income as well. Like, it's quite extraordinary what can be done from registers. It really opened my eye to it. Not the same way that we think about it.
Absolutely. Really using them as a platform to wrap those systems and services around the families that are affected.
Gosh, that's such great purpose. So inspiring.
So I feel like we've touched on a few of these points, Sarah, but where to from here? This is an incredible, important and timely paper. What are the next steps for this work?
Yeah, well, there's a lot more to be done, which I'm very excited about. But our next paper that's actually under review at the moment, so fingers crossed it'll be out soon, is looking at the rates of CP in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in Australia. We've been working with an Aboriginal researcher and midwife for the last 6 years now. Her name's Tan Martin, and she's been working with us on the register. And so we're excited to publish that paper coming out, coming soon.
Yeah.
And there's much more to come in that space.
Yeah.
We're only just starting to get into that space and learning so much from Aboriginal research methodologies as well. So I can see that there's a big pieces of work that we will be doing in this space in Australia. The other thing that I'm particularly interested in is that when we look at GMFCS 4s and 5s, I'm not sure that there's been the same level of reduction for this group. And so I really want to look at that closely, and that's one of my next projects to see if that is true. And if it's true, then I really want to nail down the causes and causal pathways for these children to see if we're working on the right things to reduce severity going into the future for these children.
Wow.
And then our team's also really focused on reducing the risk of infections for mums during pregnancies, so in particular cytomegalovirus. That's being led by Hayley Smithers-Sheedy. So there's a lot of work to do for prevention of infections. And of course, the low and middle income, which we've spent a lot of time talking about, there's so much to do in collaboration with people. Like we are getting asked by people all around the world, almost on a weekly basis now, whether we can help them and mentor with them and work with them to set up registers in the most exciting of places all around the world. So there's a lot to be done.
That's so exciting. So
and
exciting.
The other thing is, sorry.
No, I love this. So many projects.
Great.
So good.
No, you can stop me. But the other thing really is about health inequity as well. And identifying and making sure that for people who are living with CP at the moment, the ones who need specialist services the most have got equitable access to those services. And I think the register has a role to play in saying, there might be 2 people in this particular region, but they really need services. So how are we going to make sure they get equitable access to services as well?
So many important pieces of work there.
I know. You're going to be busy.
No, who's busy?
No, so busy. But it sounds like, you've got the most incredible team and collaborations and, networks of people who are working with you on this, Sarah.
Yes,
so I'm sure, there'll be.
No one does this stuff on their own, of course.
That's right.
Of course not. But, it makes it all the more worthwhile, I think, when you get to.
And fun.
Yeah, that's right. Gosh, Sarah, you're so inspiring. I feel very inspired right now.
Me too.
I feel like we could talk for a long
work,
time. I know, we've got so much to do. Now, before you get back to work, we've got to go to the next segment. It's the return of Tell It to Ed. Ed, as you know, is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening in all of the conversations, soaking it all in, putting together a question. I am sure he is. So, Sarah, can I get you to summarise in about 60 seconds or so to Ed about this body of work we just spoke about?
Okay.
Lovely.
Hi, Ed. This body of work, in essence, has shown that the rates of cerebral palsy in high-income countries around the world is reducing. For a long time, it was stable, and now it's reducing. But however, in low and middle-income countries, the rate of cerebral palsy is at least double that of high-income countries.
Now, that is a summary. That is awesome.
That is about as succinct as you get.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. All right, Ed, over to you.
I will edit out that little cough. So I find that really, really fascinating. Listening on the conversation today, it was quite amazing to obviously hear about the lowering of the rates of CP. And then the discussion about high income versus low income countries and how things are kind of rising there or double the rate that they are in high income countries. From a layman's perspective, I've not really kind of thought how that kind of pans out. So it was kind of fascinating to get that insight. I guess my question is going to be a little bit simplistic. I think you've done a great job of making it easily digestible for people like myself. But Ash touched on this this concept of a pattern that kind of has emerged, or something that seems like a pattern, about the rates kind of increasing, the care getting better, and then the rates decreasing. I guess my question is about how far behind are middle to low income countries? Like, is there an expected time frame where you would think, look, in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we would see these kind of figures replicated like they are in, Australia or Europe or other countries, or high income countries? How far behind are they? Like, obviously, it's quite a complicated answer, but if they followed some of the steps that obviously have been put in place in Australia and in Europe.
Yeah, good and complicated question.
Sorry about that.
That summarises Tell It to Ed, I think.
So all low and middle income countries are at different journeys as far as the advent of neonatal intensive care. So it's going to be different for all of them.
Okay.
But we've saw one paper in China where they're already saying that rates are rising, and we included that in our paper. So, and they have a lot more neonatal intensive care units than others. So already rates are rising for in China, and I just think it'll be the time it takes for intensive care units to become part of the norm. So, in 10 years, I can imagine rates going up across low and middle income countries. And so we are very aware of that, and spend a lot of time discussing with colleagues about, what is it that we can do in these intervening years to try and not stop that pattern occurring, but trying to minimise it as much as possible. And as I said earlier, like taking the learnings, but putting them into context-specific situations. So I think it's probably in the next 10 years, Ed. That's a quick answer.
Wow, that's actually a shorter number or smaller number than what I was thinking.
Yeah,
That's great.
yeah.
That's really good. Good question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really good.
Thinking deeply there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. It's firing on all cylinders. First segment back.
Welcome back, Ed.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for your time. As everyone can appreciate, having a bit of your time we're so grateful because you've got so many things to do, such important work.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But thank you.
Well, thank you too. And I just wanted to shout out and say thank you for the work you two are doing, because translation of research is so important, and researchers are just trying to work out more and more ways to translate their research, and you've provided an amazing platform for people to get the word out. So you two also are doing amazing work. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sarah.
Thanks for the encouragement.
You can come back anytime.
Well, we've got quite a few things to discuss.
I know. We're going to have a regular Sarah segment by the sounds of it.
Yeah, Sarah segment. I think that sounds good. Well, to all of our listeners out there, remember you can have links to the paper as well as our show notes from today as well on ResearchWorks.net. There's a CPD form there you can fill out as well if you want to keep this as part of a record of your PD requirements. But for now, thank you once again.
Yes.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for a great question, Ed. And we'll talk to you all again next time.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.